Welcome to this explainer. If you're a literature student, or honestly just someone fascinated by how an author's real, messy life bleeds into their art, you are absolutely in the right place today. We're going to unpack Jane Austen's masterful narrative strategies in her 1813 classic Pride and Prejudice. But we aren't just going to rehash the plot, you already know the plot. Instead, we're going to explore how her bustling, chaotic, real-world upbringing directly shaped the sharp, heavily ironic fictional universe she built. We're going to break down the central irony of Elizabeth Bennet and Fitzwilliam Darcy and see exactly how Austen basically tricks us, the readers, into falling into the exact same traps as her characters.
Here's a quick roadmap for today's lecture. We'll start with her early life at Steventon Rectory, trace those family echoes into her fiction, master the concept of verbal irony, and then analyze the perfect pride and perfect prejudice of our protagonists. After that, we'll break down her famous narrative trick, free indirect discourse, and finish up with the triumph of introspection. Okay, let's dive right in and decode how Austen turned everyday social observations into absolute literary genius.
Starting off with Section 1, Life at Steventon Rectory. To truly understand Austen's fiction, we really have to step into the lively, highly theatrical laboratory of her childhood home in Hampshire. You see, Jane Austen wasn't writing in some quiet, isolated vacuum. Not at all. Born in 1775, she grew up in a wildly busy household. Her father was a rector who actually took in student boarders just to make ends meet. So imagine a house packed with 6 brothers, constantly visiting extended family, and adolescent boys studying for Oxford. Meanwhile, her mother was out managing a farmyard just to feed everybody. But here's the thing. This chaos was incredibly intellectual. In the evenings, they didn't just sit around quietly. They read classic novels out loud, played board games, and put on these super ambitious family theatricals, even performing popular stage comedies like The Sultan. Growing up in this crowded, competitive environment, Austen rapidly honed her ability to observe the ridiculous, the affected, and the deeply complex social dynamics happening literally right in her own living room.
And you can see this sharp observation early on. Her private letters to her sister Cassandra reveal her own real-world, deeply cynical wit. Describing a social acquaintance in one letter, Austen called their behavior the usual, nothing-meaning, harmless, heartless civility. I mean, ouch, right? This shows us that long before she ever published a novel, she was actively practicing the sharp defensive wit she'd later inject straight into her characters. She wasn't just casually observing Regency society, she was actively critiquing its superficiality in secret.
That brings us to Section 2, Family Echoes in Fiction. Let's look at how this real-world rectory experience built the intricate webs of society we see in her novels.
When you map out the relationships between the characters, it brilliantly illustrates the tangled, highly interdependent social networks they have to navigate. It completely mirrors the dense community of siblings, cousins, and wealthy connections Austen herself dealt with. Just as she had to navigate her wealthy relatives in Kent and her mother's aristocratic connections, her characters are entirely bound by their family ties. In Austen's world, you aren't just an individual floating in space. You're a product of your family's status, wealth, and, for better or worse, their behavior.
Which naturally brings us to the driving force of the Bennet family. The business of Mrs. Bennet's life was to get her daughters married. Now, as a study guide focus, it is vital to recognize the historical context here. Austen's own parents had to worry constantly about the economic futures of their unendowed daughters in a society with incredibly rigid class distinctions. The Bennets' actions are driven entirely by that exact same economic reality. Women in early 19th century England had very limited avenues for advancement outside of marriage. So Mrs. Bennet isn't just annoying for the sake of comedy, she's reacting to the very real, terrifying prospect of her daughters facing poverty.
So, the crucial question for literature students is, how did Austen translate her sharp observations of the society into specific literary devices? Let's move to Section 3, Mastering the Verbal Irony.
If you take away one single literary technique today, make it this one. Verbal irony is basically saying one thing, but conveying a meaning that is entirely different from, and usually opposite to, what you actually said. Austen uses verbal irony to mask true feelings or offer these incredibly biting critiques disguised as polite compliments. She challenges the accepted, rigid social norms of Regency England by having her characters say the socially acceptable thing while dripping with an opposite subtext. It is, essentially, the ultimate weapon of the powerless.
Take this quote, for example. When Elizabeth Bennet says to Mr. Darcy, "I have always seen a great similarity in the turn of our mind," it is heavily, heavily layered with sarcasm. She's actively employing the exact same defensive wit Austen practiced in her own lively household.
Under the guise of a polite compliment, Elizabeth is actually delivering an insult. She's highlighting the major thematic opposition between what is perceived and what is actually real.
And that tension leads us right to the central pivot of our analysis in Section 4, Perfect Pride, Perfect Prejudice. Let's look at these seemingly insurmountable differences between our two protagonists. Notice how their respective social backgrounds directly dictate their fatal flaws. Mr. Darcy comes from this aristocratic blue blood lineage. His isolation doesn't just stem from arrogance, but from a really grave internalization of social hierarchy and duty. Because of his wealth, he can afford his perfect pride. Elizabeth, on the other hand, comes from a provincial worldview with constant economic instability. Her perfect prejudice is actually a high-spirited defense mechanism. Because she lacks high social standing, she uses really quick judgments to assert her own intellectual equality. They represent two hemispheres of the human mind, completely isolated by their respective flaws. But how does Austen trick us into taking sides in this clash of worldviews? Well, she does it through a truly groundbreaking narrative technique, which we're covering in Section 5, Free Indirect Discourse.
This technique is arguably Austen's greatest innovation, and a primary focus for any literature student. Free indirect discourse is a third-person narrative style that adopts the tone, the vocabulary, and the intimate thoughts of a particular character. Austen writes in the third person, sure, but she deliberately limits the focus to Elizabeth's perspective. It completely blurs the line between the omniscient, all-knowing author and the heavily biased character.
Here is exactly how the trap works in two steps. First, the narrator presents an observation sounding like an objective, universal truth. But then, second, the reader slowly realizes this so-called truth actually just reflects a character's deeply biased view. By following these steps, Austen literally traps us in Elizabeth's misjudgments. Because we're locked inside Elizabeth's perspective, we share in her prejudice against Darcy, and we completely share in her misplaced trust in the wicked Wickham. We are just as blind as she is.
Look at the most famous opening line in English literature. It is a truth universally acknowledged. It starts off as an authoritative narrative comment, right? But it very quickly narrows into subjective, dramatic irony. As we read further, we realize this isn't a universal truth at all. It's the desperate, incredibly specific situational irony of Mrs. Bennet's mindset. Austen is winking at us from the very first sentence.
As we approach the conclusion of our explainer, we get to see how Austen finally resolves this grand novel-length deception in Section 6, The Triumph of Introspection. The turning point of the whole novel hinges on hard evidence. When Elizabeth is confronted by Darcy's self-explanatory letter following his disastrous first proposal, the illusion shatters. Elizabeth is forced to acknowledge her judgmental error and her own susceptibility to charm. But the transformation is parallel. Darcy's aristocratic arrogance softens through humility and candor, while Elizabeth sheds her prejudice through profound emotional honesty. The ultimate union between them isn't just some romantic fairy tale ending, it is a mutual correction of flaws. It proves that human fallibility can be overcome, but only through really intense self-awareness.
And that intense realization is perfectly captured right here. Till this moment, I never knew myself. The central irony of the entire novel is resolved in this one sentence. Because the exact moment Elizabeth realizes her perfect prejudice was completely wrong is the exact moment we, the readers, realize Austen has fooled us too. We judge Darcy just as quickly as she did.
So, as you reflect on Austen's journey from a bustling, competitive rectory at Steventon, full of theatricals and sharp wit, to penning these enduring masterpieces, I want you to ask yourself something. How does your own social environment bias your daily judgments? Do your own first impressions and inner monologues suffer from the same pride and prejudice Austen so perfectly captured? It's a question that is absolutely just as relevant today as it was in 1813. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember to keep questioning those first impressions.